My name is Brendan, and the week that changed everything started as nothing more than a playful challenge. My best friend Richard and I had always been close, a bond built on years of trust, banter, and secrets only we shared. But when I jokingly gave him 1 week to turn me gay, I never thought he'd actually take me up on it. It was supposed to be harmless fun, a ridiculous bet between friends. At first, it was just Richard being Richard. His usual flirtatious humor and a confidence I admired but never thought much of. But as the week unfolded, I started noticing things I hadn't before. The way his laughter lingered, the intensity in his gaze, and the ease with which he understood parts of me I didn't even understand myself. What began as a game quickly unraveled into something deeper, more complicated, and far riskier than I could have imagined. By the time I realized what was happening, I was already in too deep. This wasn't just a test of my sexuality, it was a test of boundaries, loyalty, and the unspoken feelings we'd both been burying. And in crossing that line, there was no turning back. Before we get started, don't forget to hit subscribe and show your support for LGBTQ+ stories like this. Sharing these voices keeps our community's experiences alive and celebrated. Thank you for being here. Now let's begin. My name is Brendan, and I've always been confident in who I am, or at least I thought I was. I had the career, the fiancé, the kind of life you could tie a neat little bow around. And then there was Richard, my best friend since high school, openly gay, charming, and quick with a comeback. He was the kind of person who could disarm anyone with a single glance or a cutting joke. Despite our differences, he'd always been my anchor, my constant. But one conversation on an otherwise ordinary night changed everything. It started over drinks at his apartment. Richard had invited me over for one of our usual catch-ups, beer for me, wine for him. We sprawled out on his couch, the city skyline glittering behind him, and the conversation drifted into one of those lazy debates we love to have. Somehow, the topic landed on relationships and identity. You know, he said, swirling his glass of wine, I think sexuality is a lot more fluid than you'd like to admit. I rolled my eyes and laughed. Richard, you've been saying that for years. It's not going to change the fact that I like women. Specifically, one woman. Richard raised an eyebrow, his smirk sharpening. I'm just saying, everyone's got a little wiggle room. Even you, Mr. Straight and Narrow. I shook my head, amused. Not me. I'm a rock. Unwavering. He leaned closer, resting his chin on his hand. 1 week. I blinked. What? 1 week, he repeated, his tone both playful and daring. Give me 1 week, Brendan, and I'll prove it to you. I'll show you that sexuality isn't as rigid as you think. I snorted. You're joking. Dead serious, he said, his expression suddenly unreadable. No pressure, no tricks. Just let me show you what you're too stubborn to see. Worst case, you'll win the argument and get to gloat. Best case. His voice trailed off, but the weight of his words lingered. I leaned back, crossing my arms. You really think you could turn me gay in a week? Come on, Richard. I've known you for over a decade. I think I'd know by now if I was into you. He shrugged, his smirk returning. It's not about turning anyone. It's about opening your mind. But if you're so sure of yourself, what's the harm in a little experiment? I stared at him, half amused, half challenged. The idea was absurd, but there was something about the way he looked at me, mischievous, confident, and just the tiniest bit vulnerable, that made me hesitate. Fine, I said finally, raising my beer in mock toast. 1 week. But when nothing happens, I get to say, I told you so for the rest of our lives. Richard clinked his glass against mine, his smirk widening into a grin. Deal? It was supposed to be a joke. A bet. A ridiculous game between friends. But the moment the words left my mouth, something shifted between us. The air felt heavier, charged with an energy I couldn't quite name. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, at least on the surface. We joked, we argued about music, we reminisced about high school. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Richard was looking at me differently. Or maybe I was just imagining it. When I finally headed home, the thought lingered in the back of my mind. It was silly, really. What could he possibly do in a week to make me question who I was? I'd been with my fiancée, Emma, for 3 years. She was everything I wanted. Smart, kind, beautiful. I loved her, didn't I? But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't help but replay the conversation in my head. The way Richard's voice had softened when he issued the challenge. The way his gaze had lingered, just a second too long. And the way my chest had tightened, not with discomfort, but with something closer to curiosity. I shook my head, pushing the thought away. It was just Richard being Richard, provocative, playful, and always looking for a way to get under my skin. But deep down, a small, unwelcome part of me wondered if I just made a mistake. The next morning, I found myself checking my phone for a message from Richard. There was nothing. He was probably waiting for me to make the first move, to show some sign that I was taking the bet seriously. I wasn't, of course. Still, as I got ready for the day, I couldn't ignore the undercurrent of anticipation thrumming beneath the surface. What had I gotten myself into? And more importantly, why did a part of me feel excited to find out? The first day of the bet passed almost uneventfully. Almost. Richard didn't bring it up directly, and I certainly wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of asking what his plan was. Still, there was an unmistakable shift in the way he carried himself around me. Subtle, but enough to keep me on edge. We'd agreed to meet for dinner that evening. It wasn't unusual for us to grab a meal together, but this time, something felt different. Richard had chosen a small, dimly lit restaurant tucked away from the bustle of the city. The kind of place that felt intimate by design. He greeted me with his usual easy smile, but there was something in his eyes, a glint of mischief, perhaps, or maybe something deeper. I couldn't tell. "Don't look so nervous," he said as we sat down. "It's just dinner, Brendan. I'm not going to bite." I laughed, trying to sound as relaxed as he did. "I'm not nervous. Just wondering how you plan to win this ridiculous bet." Richard leaned back in his chair, studying me with an infuriating calm. "I'm not in a rush. We've got a week. Besides, this isn't about winning or losing. It's about opening your mind." I rolled my eyes, but the words lingered. As the evening went on, I couldn't help but notice the way Richard's attention was entirely focused on me. He listened intently, laughed at all the right moments, and occasionally let his hand brush mine when he reached for something on the table. It was subtle, so subtle I almost convinced myself it wasn't intentional. Almost. When we parted ways that night, I felt unsettled. Not because of anything Richard had said or done, but because of the way I caught myself thinking about him on the drive home. I told myself it was just the bet, the lingering absurdity of it all. Nothing more. By the second day, Richard had shifted gears. He didn't mention the bet at all. Instead, he invited me over to his apartment for a movie. It was something we'd done countless times before, but this time, the atmosphere felt different. He chose a romantic drama, something with sharp dialogue and slow, deliberate tension. I joked about his terrible taste, but halfway through the film, I realized I wasn't paying attention to the story. I was paying attention to him. The way he sat so close on the couch, the quiet hum of his laughter, the way his hand rested casually on the cushion between us. At one point, he turned to me, his expression unreadable. "You okay?" "Yeah," I said quickly, too quickly. "Why wouldn't I be?" He shrugged, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Just checking." The moment passed, but it left something behind. By the third day, Richard's approach became more deliberate. He wasn't overtly flirtatious. Richard was too smart for that. Instead, he leaned into the kind of gestures that felt natural but were impossible to ignore. He made coffee for me when I stopped by his place after work, the kind of coffee he knew I liked but never bothered making for himself. He complimented me on things I'd never even thought about. My laugh, the way I carried myself, the way I always seemed to know what to say. "You're not as unreadable as you think, you know," he said at one point, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. What's that supposed to mean? I asked, half challenged, half curious. Just that you're a lot more transparent than you give yourself credit for? I wanted to brush it off, to laugh and move on, but something about the way he said it stayed with me. By the fourth day, I felt like I was walking a tightrope. I told myself it was just the bet, that I was only noticing these things because Richard wanted me to. But the truth was harder to ignore. It wasn't just his gestures or his words. It was the way he made me feel, seen, understood, like I didn't have to be anything other than myself around him. Emma and I had that once, I thought. Or maybe we never did, and I just convinced myself we did. That night, as Richard and I stood in his kitchen, talking about nothing in particular, he reached over to adjust my tie. Hold still, he said softly, his fingers brushing against my collar. I froze, my breath catching as he straightened the fabric. His hands lingered for a moment longer than necessary, and when he stepped back, there was something in his gaze that made my chest tighten. You're impossible, you know that? I said, half laughing, trying to diffuse the tension. He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Only because you make it so easy. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I replayed that moment in the kitchen, the warmth of his hands, the weight of his gaze, and the way it made me feel something I wasn't ready to admit. For the first time, I wondered if I was losing controls. By the fifth day, the atmosphere between Richard and me had shifted into uncharted territory. Everything felt heavier, more deliberate. Every word he spoke, every glance he threw my way, seemed to carry a weight I couldn't ignore. And the worst part? I didn't want to ignore it. I told myself this was just the game, just part of the bet. But deep down, I knew better. That afternoon, Richard invited me to join him for a walk through the park. The weather was crisp, the winter sun low in the sky, casting long shadows across the path. It should have been a simple, relaxing outing. Two friends catching up, no expectations, no pressure. But as we walked, the conversation turned to familiar yet dangerous territory. So, Richard began, his voice light but probing, how's the fiancé? I hesitated, shoving my hands into my coat pockets. She's good. Busy, you know? She's still out of town for work. Richard nodded, his expression unreadable. Do you miss her? Of course, I said quickly, but the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. He stopped walking and turned to face me. Brendan, can I ask you something? I met his gaze, heart pounding for reasons I didn't fully understand. Sure. Are you happy? The question hit harder than I expected. It wasn't accusatory, just honest. And it forced me to confront something I'd been avoiding for a long time. I think so, I said finally, though it sounded more like a question than an answer. Richard tilted his head, studying me. You think so? I looked away, focusing on a patch of bare trees in the distance. I don't know. Things have just felt off lately. Emma's great, don't get me wrong. She's everything I thought I wanted. But lately it's like we're just coasting. Like something's missing. Richard stepped closer, his voice soft but steady. Maybe you're looking for something you can't find with her? I turned back to him, caught off guard by the intensity in his eyes. What's that supposed to mean? You know what it means, he said quietly. The air between us was charged, electric. For a moment, neither of us spoke. And then, as if pulled by an invisible force, Richard reached out and rested a hand on my arm. You don't have to figure everything out right now, he said. But you can't keep lying to yourself, Brendan. You deserve to be happy. Whatever that looks like. His words cut through me, raw and honest in a way I wasn't prepared for. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but I couldn't. Because deep down, I knew he wasn't. That night, I couldn't shake the weight of our conversation. His words echoed in my mind, pulling at the threads of everything I thought I knew about myself. By the sixth day, I'd had enough. I needed answers, needed to understand what was happening between us. So I went to Richard's apartment, heart racing the entire way. He opened the door, surprised but not entirely caught off guard. "Brendan? We need to talk," I said, pushing past him into the living room. "Okay," he said cautiously, closing the door behind me. "What's going on?" I turned to face him, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "What are we doing, Richard? This whole bet, this game, what's the point? Because it doesn't feel like a joke anymore." "Not to me." Richard's expression softened, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of vulnerability beneath his confident exterior. "It was never a joke, Brendan. Not for me." I froze, his words hanging in the air like a challenge. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I've been in love with you for years," he admitted, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "And I know it's complicated. I know you're engaged, and I know this probably doesn't make sense to you. But I had to try. Because I can't keep pretending that what I feel doesn't matter." The room fell silent, the weight of his confession crashing over me like a tidal wave. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Richard sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm sorry if I've made things harder for you. That was never my intention. I needed you to know." Before I could stop myself, I closed the distance between us. "You're an idiot," I muttered. His eyes widened, and for a split second, I thought he might pull away. But then our lips met, tentative at first, then deeper, more urgent. When we finally broke apart, I couldn't bring myself to look away. "This doesn't mean I've figured everything out," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't expect you to," Richard replied, his hand lingering on my face. "I just need you to be honest, with me and with yourself." I nodded, unable to say anything more. All I knew was that, for the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't running from something. And I wasn't sure if that terrified me or set me free. The morning of the 7th day arrived, and with it, a sense of finality I wasn't ready for. I woke up in my apartment, the air feeling heavier than usual. Emma had texted me the night before, a simple, "I miss you," and for the first time, I didn't respond. Not because I didn't care, but because I didn't know what to say anymore. I spent the day pacing, lost in thought. My mind replayed everything that had happened over the past week. The conversations, the stolen glances, the kiss I couldn't bring myself to regret. Richard had upended everything I thought I knew about myself, and now, standing at the edge of a decision, I felt paralyzed. By the evening, I knew I had to see him. I needed clarity, needed to face whatever this was head-on. I showed up at his apartment without calling, my heart pounding in my chest. Richard opened the door, his expression guarded but soft. "Brendan," he said quietly, stepping aside to let me in. I didn't sit down. I couldn't. "I've been thinking," I began, my voice steadier than I expected. "Me too," Richard said, leaning against the edge of the counter. His calmness was maddening, but I knew he was waiting for me to take the lead. "I don't know what this means," I admitted. "I don't know what I'm feeling or what I'm supposed to do. All I know is that this week, it's made me question everything." Richard nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. And I can't ignore it anymore," I said, the words tumbling out like a confession. "You were right, Richard. About me, about this, about us. I've been lying to myself for a long time, and I'm tired of pretending." His expression softened, and for a moment, I thought he might cry. But instead, he took a step closer, his voice quiet but steady. "What are you going to do, Brendan?" That was the question I couldn't escape. The one I'd been wrestling with all week. I thought of Emma, of the life we'd built together, and the life we were supposed to have. I thought of Richard, standing in front of me, vulnerable and unapologetically himself. And I thought of myself, the version of me I'd been running from, the one who felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. "I don't know yet," I admitted, my voice breaking. "But I know I can't lose you." Richard reached out, his hand brushing against mine. "You won't," he said softly. "No matter what you decide, I'll be here. But Brendan, you deserve to be happy. Just promise me you'll choose that. Whatever it looks like." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. I promise. As I left his apartment that night, the weight in my chest felt lighter. I didn't have all the answers, but for the first time, I was ready to face the questions.